Hi, my name is Chris Wynder. I'm the Director of Developer Programs here at OpenText. And I'm really happy to have one of our really great partners and customers with us, AbleDocs. Adam, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm Adam Spencer. I'm the President and CEO of AbleDocs. We're the worldwide leader in digital accessibility products and services.
Great. You know what? What I want to do today, Adam, is just get some of your perspective on accessibility, how that fits in industries. And where I'd like to start is just a big picture. What do you do with your customers, your clients, your partners? What does AbleDocs really do for their customers?
We get asked that question a lot. And I think the answer is we're really in the business of risk mitigation for our customers. Digital accessibility is so prevalent in every industry, in every organization of all sizes. There aren't language barriers, there aren't border barriers. This is something that touches everyone's life, and every organization needs to ensure that their content is reaching the widest audience possible. So there's legislation around the world that mandates you cannot discriminate against someone based on their disability. So what we do is empower organizations to ensure that their web content, their document content, anything that's being produced and distributed is accessible and compliant with the relevant standards and laws.
Great. Now, let's dig. That's a really cool point, and I want to dig a little bit into that to start off with. If you had 10 seconds with a CEO, what would be your kind of 3 to 5 kind of best practices you'd want them to come away with?
We always look at it as a 4-pillared approach. You need to be able to understand what's going on. So you take that assessment, and most organizations don't really know where they stand when it comes to their accessibility footprint. They look at it as, well, we have an elevator and we have a ramp into the building. But the reality is you're creating so much content on a regular basis. So we've got to see what you have today, see how you're creating those things tomorrow, fixing all of the old things that still need to be available to your consumers or your constituents. And then you've got to really change the culture by teaching people what is it to be accessible. I think what we've seen over such a long period of time is that organizations thought that everyone needs to be an expert in digital accessibility. Everyone needs to be aware of what it is to be accessible, but not everyone is going to be a subject matter expert. And that's where we come in and then validate. You're using tools, excellent. You're creating great content. Now we need to make sure that the content you're creating is actually accessible. So we look at that validate, create, educate, and remediate approach to make sure that organizations see what's going on at any given time. And a CEO needs to see a high-level report. The person writing the document or creating that content just needs to make sure that it's being published in an accessible way. But with, particularly in the US, the amount of litigation against organizations that are ignoring their digital accessibility requirements, it's costing them millions upon millions of dollars, where it would cost a fraction of that just to make it accessible from the start.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And when you say digital content, and we're talking about still a little bit on the best practices, is there any content that probably shouldn't be made accessible? Is there a place to start? Is there a place to avoid?
The answer is starting anywhere is the best place. Doing nothing and putting your head in the sand is just not going to be successful. I think one of the things that we constantly hear from organizations, we don't know where to start. And the answer is just start. Do an assessment, see where you are, get a scan. At least you know what's good, bad, and ugly. You're validating whether that is accessible or not. And the reality is you may not be as bad as you think, or you may find things that you didn't even know were there. When you start to zero in on a plan, and building a strategic plan for digital accessibility is so important, you need to know what your web properties are doing, what your document content is doing, what your apps are doing. How are you being able to gauge whether those items are accessible or not, and then build a strategic plan, because we haven't found this yet, an organization that has an unlimited budget. We keep looking, but it's hard to find.
Be nice to find.
It would, but finding where we can start to get quick wins, mitigating that exposure. What documents or pages on your website are being hit as at most, and trying to start strategically understanding how we build a plan that will be sustainable. This isn't just a drop in the bucket. You've got to continue this plan forward. And we've seen that with organizations where they thought, oh, we've done it once, so we're good. And one thing that any content author or web dev will tell you, we load new content every day. We change things on sites. We want to continue to build forward. Otherwise, we're stagnant with our content. And you've got to remember that quick wins come fairly easily when you look at remediating a single PDF, like an annual report. That can take a day or 3 maybe. It depends on how big. But a website is like moving an aircraft carrier. It's just a big project and involves so many different contributors that it takes so much more planning to make sure that it's going to be accessible. So you really need to start segmenting and looking at how you get those small victories to ultimately build towards the big ones on a product refresh, as an example.
That kind of segues nicely into the next thing I wanted to bring up with you and get some advice for the audience. It was really around the idea of roadblocks. When you think of your first meetings with the actual project team, not necessarily the CEO, but the actual project team, what are those roadblocks that you kind of know going into it, you and the team are going to have to overcome?
I would say fear and ego. I think is a really fair statement. And I don't mean that negatively to anyone, but for some reason, we as humans like to believe that we know everything. And if we show a question or admit that we don't know something, well, I've failed and I'm out the door. The reality is you probably don't know everything you need to know about digital accessibility, and that's okay. That's why people like us exist as subject matter experts. I'm not a dentist, but I have teeth. And it's one of those, we can learn that skill, but it's going to take time. And recognizing that this is a journey rather than a quick fix button. You just can't do that. So those roadblocks are people being reluctant to learn where those gaps are. And what we do in digital accessibility is really just an extension of great design, great development, great implementation, but using the right tools and techniques or services and software to get us to where we need to be accessible.
Yeah, and I think I want to take you on a little bit of a side trip for 1 second, if you'll indulge me. So one of the things that myself and the OpenText team working with other developers often hear is, that's a post problem. That's not an app problem. I'm just a web dev. It's CSS and HTML. It's always the same. I see the snicker in your face, and I think you're probably the same opinion as I am. It's not quite. So when you think about how you work with web devs and potentially partners of customers, what's kind of the 3 things that you find important that they should understand that maybe they're not quite getting right from a dev and product perspective?
Again, it goes back to that fear of the unknown. If you recognize that when you are building with accessibility and inclusivity in mind, it will be vastly easier, faster, and significantly more cost effective than trying to fix something that's been built in an inaccessible way. And it always pains me. We'll get a call from an organization saying, we've been trying this for weeks, we don't know what to do, and we fix it in 30 minutes. And it's not because they're not good developers, it's just they don't know.
Yeah.
So it's again that skill building of, if we start to plan with an accessible framework from the start, that one doesn't mean we're taking anything away from design. It doesn't take away anything from interaction or engagement with the content. We are building a framework that's actually more versatile. It's going to be responsive on multiple devices, different screen sizes, different audiences. And I think we forget that when we as developers are building out an experience, we're doing it with our blinders on. We're like a horse with those horse blinders on. Rather than recognizing that people are going to interact with your content in a way that works for them. And you don't know who your audience is. When you realize the pervasiveness of different interaction with content because of different learning styles, different reading styles, different device types, different visual acuity or ability, you don't know. And when we hear, well, our audience doesn't have a disability, one, that's the most ignorant statement I've ever heard in my life. And two, you don't know, because the majority of disabilities are invisible.
Yeah.
So, when we look at 50% of the male population over the age of 60 being colorblind, that's a massive amount of the population that can't see your text that is yellow. They're little things, but if we made sure that that content was accessible, that user probably already has their device set up in a way that works best for them. And we're creating that type of engagement that all of us as content authors and developers crave. We want you to use what we've done.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. And I think maybe, one of the things that is always interesting is new content. And everybody starts focusing on the asset type first. Well, it needs to be a paper document. Well, what does that mean? So when you start working with people and you get the opportunity to work on their strategy, how do you approach that idea of accessible versus, it has to be something that they can download? How do you deal with those kind of mindsets?
It's funny. I was on a government webpage today that a government in Europe had made an announcement, and they were bragging about how accessible their content was, which it was. It was plain text in a web page, and it scrolled for a day and a half. And the concept of everything needing to be PDF or everything needing to be HTML, this pendulum swing, needs to stop. I've been preaching this for 15 years. It is not a fight. We can all get along in the content wars. It's okay. But not everything is going to be consumed in the way that makes it easier for you to comply with legislation or litigation. And we've seen, again, particularly in government, well, everything needs to be HTML because then it's accessible.
Yeah.
But it isn't. From a usability perspective, I have no structure. I have nothing to go on other than this long, drawn-out body of text. So yes, you can pass a checker, but you fail on usability.
Yeah.
So we always look at it as, how is the content being created? What's that life cycle of the content? How fast is it being created? Is it going to be a digital copy that's designed to be distributed? Do you need a document of record? Not everything can just be text. We can't simplify things like financial tables. They have to be a table.
Yeah.
Those types of conversations of, what are you creating? Who's creating it? How fast are you creating it? Can this be automated? Does it need manual intervention? How do you expect someone to engage with what's being put on a quote unquote page? And I agree that not everything is designed to be on a page anymore. But you've got to be thinking about, how is this being distributed? And do I need multiple copies of the same thing just to appease a requirement? And the answer is no. We can make any format fully accessible in the exact same way of another format, just by realizing what's required in those specs. That standardization of what is an accessible document, what is an accessible web page. There's a reason why standards exist. And the reason that people find workarounds is because they don't know how to do it. That's the only reason.
That brings up a good point. And I think one of the things that I've heard a lot lately. So I come from a healthcare background, and as you know, we've had these conversations before in the past. And one of the things that often comes up in healthcare is that scannability, so that usability part, and the speech to text. Now, it sounds like part of full spectrum accessibility is really around that idea of speech to text, and that being the same chunk of content, but maybe a little tweak on it. So given where we're at, so it's August of 2023, and unless you've been under a rock, you've heard of ChatGPT and all the AI tools. Sounds like there's a possibility that there's a bigger picture value add by moving to a more accessible document type. Because if it's machine readable for speech to text or text to braille, it's machine readable. Is that a fair statement? Is that something that people are asking about now, Adam, or is that kind of not on the radar?
Absolutely. And this started with SEO. It started with search engine. If we could create a readable file, all of a sudden it could be crawled. That content is indexable. Now we're starting to get those requests of, we want to build a better engine. There's so much content that's, I'll say, locked up. It's just waiting to get out there. It's dog on a chain, ready to go. We just need to make sure that we've put that structure in place so that we're able to feed those machine learning engines that ultimately provide us with greater context. I think one of the things that people forget about ChatGPT and any of the other competitive offerings, that is being fed from content.
Yeah.
It's not just created. And one of the things that is missing still is the validation of that content.
Yeah.
How do we know how good of a response we're getting from AI? Well, it's only as good as the information that's being fed in. It's not just coming up with an answer, it's being fed that information. So making sure that you've got structured content that's fully accessible creates that opportunity to build a better model going forward for AI.
So when you think about digital content and truly accessible, who wins? I guess I'll just ask it that simply. Who benefits?
Everyone. There is not a single person that doesn't benefit from accessible content. And I think it's one of those things where we very quickly recognize that this isn't an accommodation. This is an opening opportunity for us to better interact with stagnant content.
Yeah.
When you think about reuse and reflow and re-engagement with content, making something accessible benefits everyone. There is not a single experience that isn't benefited, whether that's zooming in on your phone so you can see something better, or whether that's distributing content to someone in a secure way, whether that's making sure that you've got compliance, whether it's under HIPAA from a health standpoint. We need to make sure that people understand the value of that information, the integrity of that information, and the ability to interact with it in a way that works best for them. Not, I think you should read it this way. And I always go back to the difference between, I can read a book or you can read me a bedtime story. But the way that I'm going to interact with that content, if I can read it, is very different. And you start to see how we can repurpose what we've created to give more people more access. So it really comes back to a better development environment, a better interaction environment, and ultimately better access to information. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah. And honestly, Adam, I think that's a great place to leave off. That final message is better access to information and the right information. Adam, I really appreciate your time today. Do you have any last words for the audience, whether they're developers or whether they are government or some other enterprise? Any last words?
Yeah, I think the overarching statement is, don't be afraid to ask. I think one of the coolest things about the accessibility space is that we're here to help. And that includes our biggest competitors and people just entering the space. There's an engagement that we just want to make sure that you are getting the most out of your content and your audience is receiving as much access to it as possible. So don't be afraid to reach out. We can solve the problem.
Well, with that, we appreciate your time today. This has been Adam Spencer from AbleDocs. I'm Chris Wynder from OpenText. And thanks for your time.